Greetings and welcome to the writings of Soren Kierkegaard. Can you hear my Danish accent? A lot of the Danes and a lot of people in Europe and across the world, just a matter of fact, now that I think about it, a lot of the world speaks English. So Denmark, the second language in Denmark, which is the term for that is called the lingua franca. I think that's how it's pronounced. Is English, because you have people from different countries coming into Denmark and a language they all share in common. It may not be Danish, but it could be English. Yes, I am back. I am back in the States. I was excited yesterday to see that last night when I got home that the wildflowers, the blooms, the flowers themselves are still colorful. They're going to freeze. It's finally cool in Pennsylvania. It's been an interesting summer. It's been hot, and it was dry for a while too. So it's kind of more like Arizona versus Kentucky or something. But I'm back, and I want to do a podcast before things settle down too much. It's kind of like the waters have been stirred, so I don't promise coherence today. I don't think I should ever really promise that based on how I think. But I would say that's similar to Soren. If I'm in any way similar to Soren, it would be in my my analogical thinking, which causes me to go in circles and to see relationships on things that don't appear to be related. It's just something that God has given me, and it's kind of a gift and it's kind of a curse, I suppose. But Soren, being a writer, uses a lot of imagery and a lot of things from nature, a lot like Jesus. Jesus being the creator God, understands nature in a way that has arisen from his creativity, and so he understands it. And again, I don't know how being God and being man and how that's possible without blowing your head up, and the universe being so much bigger than the ancients imagined. And even during Soren's time, we had no idea of the immensity of space. And if we think this planet is unique in the sense that it's close to a sun and it possibly has life, I don't know. Maybe the Earth is the first of all. It's the first place that God decided to put his ideas in practice. And here we are, humanity. I don't know. It's a big universe. The chance that there's life out there somewhere else is probable. The Bible doesn't speak of it, but that doesn't mean much one way or another. There's a lot the Bible doesn't speak about. It's still important, but the Bible gets to the heart of the matter. It talks about love. It talks about love to God, and love to man. Oh, where do I start? Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. What a whirlwind of an experience. I don't travel in groups. I don't travel with like tours. And I don't fault people to do that. That's a way to make places that could be unfamiliar doable. Some people maybe would prosper more in a situation where they're being guided and led around and told things, and they still get a piece of a good culture, like to travel regardless of whether you're in a group or you have a tour guide or whatever the situation is. Those curated things, they're meant to kind of minimize the chaos and maximize the sightseeing. It's really sightseeing more than anything. I don't do it that way. My personality is I want to go alone and try to figure it out, or with a small coterie of people, maybe one or two others, and try to figure it out and try to make sense of it. So I really don't know where to start. But it was an amazing experience being in Copenhagen for my birthday and to walk the streets that Soren walked, and to see the buildings where he went to school and where he died, the hospital. Went to the family gravesite. Still sightseeing, excuse me. But it's kind of on a personal level. I'm just there soaking it in and trying to move back in my mind to the 1850s or 1840s and just saying, okay, Copenhagen's not the same, but the DNA is still there. The bricks are still there, a lot of them. The buildings, most of them are still there. Denmark made peace with the Nazis early, and I suppose that's just survival. They didn't put up much of a resistance from what I could tell, at least officially. So that's not an admirable part of their history, I suppose. But they're Denmark. What are they going to do against the Nazis? But they didn't go out in a fight. They kind of just took it and signed the agreement, and there it was. And Denmark wasn't a key spot in the World War II. It was accessible to Norway, which was important for various reasons, which I won't get into. But yeah, an amazing experience, and there may be some value next week for me to revisit in a more official way. But I wanted to do this while I was still raw, because this trip really it really pushed me in a way. The travel itself is hard, being so tall. Being on a plane it's just the worst. I just can't get comfortable on planes, even when I buy extra legroom. Now, fortunately, I did buy extra legroom, which for Play Airlines, which is the budget airline going to Copenhagen, if I didn't have extra legroom, it would have been like being tortured. I would have confessed to anything. I'm guilty, whatever it is. I'll sign the dotted line. Yeah, I'm a communist. I kidnapped the Lindbergh baby. Whatever. I'm the man. So I had extra leg room, so I had enough room to sit, barely, just enough. And but man, I couldn't sleep, and that was hard going from the States to Copenhagen. It was just hard. I didn't sleep a wink on the plane. Now I've had worse plane trips, like to the Philippines, of course, and back after having food poisoning in the Philippines and a screaming baby in my ear all night. 25-hour flight from the Philippines. That was rough. But I was a bit younger then, not a lot younger. It was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer. You know how time flies. But I'm getting older, so I'm less flexible. So it was a tough flight. And I got to Copenhagen. Now, Copenhagen's 6 hours earlier than we are. So right now in Copenhagen, it's 6 hours minus 5:30 or plus 5:30, so like 11:30 in the morning, almost noon. Some mathematical calculation is hard here. So I'm back on Pennsylvania time. When I was in Copenhagen, I decided to stay up until about 1 o'clock. So I had a hybrid schedule. I didn't try to force myself into Copenhagen time, like wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning or 7. I try to sleep into about 9, get about 8 hours sleep if possible, so that when I came back, I'd be able to drive home. Because I had to drive home from Baltimore, Washington International, Thurgood Marshall Airport, International Airport, or whatever it is. Excuse me for snorting. I'm really trying to watch my nose here, but it's just sometimes hard to do. And last night at BWI, they're getting out of it. There was a huge accident on 695, and that bridge had been knocked out, so people now have to go around the loop. They can't take that bridge anymore since it was run into by that freighter. And some guy was trying to catch a flight from Baltimore somewhere to see his kid, and he got caught in an enormous traffic jam. So yesterday, Google had adjusted, and it put me on a... They say that Google should have a ghetto feature, avoid the ghetto feature. And last night I felt that a little bit. I know it's so prejudiced to say that, but man, it put me on all these back roads through Baltimore from BWI to avoid 695 so I could jump on 695-83 north. And I was in the hood for a while. And it wasn't super, super bad, but it wasn't dark yet either. It was just right around, right around sunset, right around dusk. And it's a different ball game if you're in Baltimore at night and in places you shouldn't be. And there's a lot of good people in the inner city. I'm not here to judge them. They've had harder lives than I would ever imagine. Most of them are just trying to keep their head above water. They've dealt with harder things than I could ever imagine in a trillion years. But there's an element there that's been affected by that and decided to go the dark way and choose the evil path. And a guy like me is easy pickings. Driving a nice car, big white boy, looks like he shouldn't belong. Yes, that's me. Raise my hand. That is indeed me. So where do I start with this trip, man? I wanted to tell a story that Johannes, one of my tour guides, told me. We've met through the podcast, and I don't know if he listens to the podcast on a regular basis. He's pretty informed about Soren Kierkegaard, probably more than me in a lot of ways, because he's actually Danish. I read a lot, so maybe I'm compatible in that way. But Johannes and I met, I think it was on Sunday. It was super rainy. Like Copenhagen's weird in the sense that Pennsylvania is like this to some degree, but nothing like Copenhagen. Copenhagen can be really, really awful in the morning, like, like raincoat, umbrella, just get inside or walk around and just be wet all day. So Sunday morning was pretty rainy. I went to a bookstore and I bought like a summary of Soren Kierkegaard. It's an English book. It's written in English. They have this little tiny section of Soren Kierkegaard. All the writings, as far as I could tell, were in English. That tells you something. It's a good summary of the book, but I was just kind of killing time, and Johannes wanted to move the tour from 3 until 1, which was fine with me because I obviously had nothing else to do besides that. And so we got together, and it started clearing up. I think it's sunny. I don't think until a little bit later in the afternoon. But he gave me kind of the enhanced Soren Kierkegaard tour because I obviously know a lot already as compared to most people, at least. And he was sensitive to that. So he took me to places that he wouldn't take other people or change things up a bit. But he told me an interesting story about when Soren's funeral was. Soren had had a medical emergency out on the street, and a coffee barista told me what the corner was. I couldn't find it online anywhere, so I don't know if the guy was correct or not, but he gave me the corner street where Soren fell in the street and was taken to the hospital. And Soren was in the hospital for several days, 7 or 8 days before he died, and refused communion from the official church, because at that point he was really alienated from the official church. Throughout his life, he had somewhat of an ambivalent relationship with official Christianity and Christendom. But as he got older, he saw how evil it was, and he went on the attack, and it affected him because at this point he was not playing. He never really was playing. He was always a serious person, but the invective became very strong because he felt like he had to arouse the church. He had to scream because they weren't listening. They weren't paying attention. Like, I'll whisper if you hear me, but I'll yell if you don't, and that kind of thing. So at the funeral, apparently what happened is a lot of street people came to the service, and there was a lot of controversy of whether they were going to have a funeral service at a church to start with, because it's pretty clear that Soren probably wouldn't have wanted that. And I just say probably because we don't know definitively, but based on his trajectory, the last place he would have wanted to have his life memorialized would have been a church, a state church, Christendom. The street people came for an interesting reason. This is what Johannes told me, and I assume he knows this, and I assume this story checks out. But I went to where Soren died. The hospital itself is still there, and I went to where he fell in the street, at least according to the coffee barista, because I couldn't find the information online. I didn't search vociferously for it. But a lot of street people, vagabonds or whatever they would have been called, riffraff or the lower classes or servants or whatever, these type of people came to Soren's funeral. Now, there's a reason why that was really controversial on a lot of different levels. So I have to step back and share with you what Johannes told me. Soren's family was very wealthy. Now, the father had not been wealthy when he was a child and had cursed God when he was working in the fields in the Jutland or whatever. But Soren's father had moved to Copenhagen to work with an uncle that had a hosiery business or something with wool or something. Like it was some kind of manufacturing of things that were necessary clothing, like the fabric for clothing. I think that was his big gig, although he got into other things too. Soren's dad did. So Soren's father winds up becoming a very wealthy man, and that's how Soren was able to write all these books, because when his father passed away in particular, and even before he passed away, his dad was always paying Soren's bills that he incurred all over town with his cigar smoking and his theatrical visits and his eating out and all the other things he was doing. But when the father passed away, left a sizable amount of money to the surviving children, which was Soren and his older brother, I think, Peter, right? I could be wrong about that. So Soren had this huge, relatively large amount of money to spend. And so they were wealthy. Soren's family was wealthy. Now, the interesting thing is that Soren was the child of the servant girl. It wasn't the the elder Kierkegaard's first wife who had passed away, and all the other children were in the process of passing away too. Like, it was just this family had this. Nah, it's not that unusual back then, but maybe more unusual than some. They had a lot of the children started passing away before the father did. So the father passed away, but before that, the Kierkegaards were a wealthy family from the merchant class, which was kind of a new niche. You know, we're out of feudalism, moving into the industrial economy. Things are changing. You know, steam engines and trains, and the world is starting to change in some very real ways outside of just everybody working in agriculture directly. So Soren's from the wealthy class, but his family has some background in a lower, what would we consider a lower class, and that's really, really pejorative. I don't like that term lower and higher. That maybe income's one way of quantifying that, but that's laden with all kinds of moral judgment. But Soren's mom was illiterate, and Soren's father gotten her pregnant, and I think the sequence is that they were kind of having sex, outside of marriage, because his first wife had passed away. Now he has a servant girl in the household, and they start developing feelings for each other. I'm not saying it's like not a mutual thing. It could have been abusive. It could have been coercive. It could have been like Me Too stuff. But it appears like they had a happy marriage, Soren's mom. But Soren doesn't write about his mom very much. Like, very, very little reference to him in his official writings, whereas his father's all over the place, including the dedications for a lot of his books, especially after he passed. So Soren's father wouldn't let him go outside because Copenhagen was nasty. People would dump their sewage on the street and garbage. The outside apparently was for servants. It was for peddlers. It was for tradespeople that had to, build things. Like anything outdoorsy was considered like hands off. And Soren's father didn't let him go outside a lot. Outside of things like going to school and things. And Soren wanted to go outside. He wanted to walk. He wanted to be outside playing. He wanted, like, whatever. He liked to be outdoors, but his father wouldn't let him. So in their very large household they had, the father used to tell stories about walking through Copenhagen, but doing it just as an auditory thing. And I did an auditory tour when I was in Copenhagen on my phone, which was super interesting. It's a little dated, but the information was really, really good. It was a good precursor to Johannes's tour on Sunday, which was really much more advanced. And so Soren developed this really active imagination walking through his house. He had this large home, and his father would walk him through, talking about all the sights he would see and all this. But as Soren got older, and there's a point to this story, and it's so cool, and I hope it's true because it just tells me so much about Soren, is as Soren got older, he either defied his father and went outside, and he was probably a teenager, or when his father passed away. Now, Soren was convinced that he was going to die before his father did. So I think his father died while Soren was still a young enough man that he could go out and about and walk around and all that stuff. And Soren, as we know, used to like to talk to people, and he wasn't talking to the rich people outside. Because what Johannes told me is that the only people that would be outside walking around in the muck and in the horse manure and the human sewage and all the trash that was just thrown on the street were relatively poor people. The servant class, the servants would go outside the household. And this is what happened with the Kierkegaards. If you needed a chicken, or you needed some brandy, or you needed some clothing or whatever, you sent your servants out to do that nasty work, right? So when Soren was out and about walking, he would talk to people of all different shapes and sorts, and mostly the poor, and they smelled. And they were smoked. They were part of an environment that was very toxic. They didn't really understand. At least they didn't act like they understood. The Romans built sewers, so I don't think they understood the component of disease as much, of how, like, if you don't get your sewage treated and out of your water supply, you're really in trouble. I think maybe the Romans were just like, it's disgusting, so they built these sewers even in ancient Rome and other places. Now, it took a lot of money, but that happened in Philadelphia too. They would just open their front window or their second floor window and just dump out the chamber pot right out on the street. So it's pretty gnarly. But Soren had befriended all these people that rich people just didn't normally associate with. He was a lot like Jesus, right? Like, he's a lot like Jesus. So when he died, all these people wanted to come to his funeral into this very proper Danish church where they would normally be shooed out, and James talks about this a lot in his epistle. Like, you play favorites to the rich man. You see that he has a diamond ring. You say, hey, you sit here in a good place. You tell the poor man to sit at your feet. He said, aren't you, what does James say there? It's just a harsh invective against the rich. You're playing favorites. And, Christ plays favorites, surprisingly, but he plays favorites with the poor and the oppressed and the abused and the broken and the lonely. And, honestly, most of us are that. We don't see ourselves like that. We don't think we're the ones he's talking about when he talks about the lonely. Come to me, all that you that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. I'm okay, Jesus. I can hire people to do that for me. I don't need you for it. And Soren Kierkegaard, in his book Training in Christianity, talks about the irony of Jesus' said of not having a place to lay his head. Like, Jesus in real life was extremely poor, right? He didn't have much in the worldly sense, right? And neither did his earthly family. And when I went to Soren's grave, it's a family plot. And my brother was joking around that he thought I was talking about Jesus. And I was like, well, first of all, Jesus wouldn't be there. He's been resurrected. Number two, Jesus' earthly family was so poor they would not have a marked grave. They would just be put where dead people went. That's all that would happen. So we would not know where Mary and Joseph's grave would be. That would be almost an impossibility from the ancient days of 2,000 years ago, and then some, around 2,000 years ago. You know what I'm saying? So it created this huge stink at this church that all these vagabonds and all these street people and all these laborers came in and paid their respects. Now, all right, let's talk about human nature here for a minute. Some of the street people, that crowd, they could have been up to just raising a ruckus. They like to do that sometimes. Let's admit that sin is in all places, in all times, in all people. But I have to assume a good chunk of the outsiders, and they truly were the outsiders versus the insiders, because the wealthy in Copenhagen just did not go outside. They stayed inside as much as they could. That was considered being privileged. That was considered enjoying your wealth and lording it over others, that you didn't have to go outside and get horse manure on your shoes or whatever. So I have to assume there was perhaps an element at that funeral that just wanted to raise a ruckus and took enjoyment in that. But I have to also assume there's a lot of poor people there, and servants and street people and the neglected and the prostitutes and the tax collectors, all these unsavory people. They wanted to come into the funeral service and to pay their respects because Soren talked to them. Soren chatted with them. Soren was interested in their lives. And that, to me, we can write about Christianity. We can talk about going to church. We can do a lot of things to prop up our religious identity. But if we don't act like Jesus, and this is what Soren was so emphatic about, if we do not model our life to look like his, in the sense of compassion towards people that life has been hard on, and compassion to everybody, honestly, except for the people that think they don't need him, because they're not going to get compassion, because they're not going to come to Jesus for that. They're not going to ask him for rest. The person who gets the harshest response from Jesus is the one who doesn't understand him, the one that thinks he's a madman or a lunatic or a misguided or a poor person himself. Like, you're not going to teach me. I have all the credibility and all the credentials and all the heritage to lord it over you, this Nazarene carpenter or whatever. So the funeral procession became quite raucous, and I think it was this nephew pointed out that Soren wouldn't have wanted the service to be at the church anyway. And so this whole crowd kind of moves out of the service and heads over to the gravesite, and there's this conflict going on in the death of Soren. I almost said Jesus, because Soren, this just reminds me so much of how Jesus acted with people, that Jesus just treated people with love and respect. But the irony is that Jesus had nowhere to lay his head, and for him to come and say and offer us peace. Right? Soren talks about how the modern churchman in Copenhagen would go, yeah, you're not the guy to offer peace, because look at you. You have nothing to offer. You're so poor. How could a person that doesn't have a place to rest his head offer rest? So the kind of rest that Jesus is talking about is not the kind of rest they're thinking about. The rest that Jesus offers is peace in the person's soul. Um, and that's what when he says, "Come to me, all you who are laden and with burdens, and et cetera, and I will offer you rest, or I'll give you rest. I will give you rest." It's an open offer to everybody too. Like if the rich man wants to come, like Nicodemus, all the better, come. But it's on Jesus's terms. Jesus never. He became all things to all men, but he was still the same person, if that makes sense. You know, he was open to people and loved people, but it was on his terms for sure. So I thought that was really interesting. So Johannes told me that story, that even in death, Soren was controversial, and it's because he loved poor people. Now, what happened was Soren stopped walking as much because, and almost cut it out completely because of his conflict with the Corsair, as we've talked about enough. But his conflict with the Corsair made it to the point that he was mocked a lot when he went outside, so he started avoiding doing it. And I think that was kind of the beginning of the end with Soren, because he was a walker by nature. And when I went to Copenhagen, I decided to buy a metro ticket when I first got there, because I wasn't sure how accessible things were going to be, if I wanted to go play disc golf or something, or if I needed to get somewhere quickly. But it turned out that I walked almost everywhere. I bought this metro ticket for a week, and I didn't use it more than once. I just took it from the airport to my hotel, and that was the only time I used the metro card. So I wound up walking every day I was in Copenhagen to some degree or another. And my Apple iPhone health statistics say that I walked on average 9 miles a day. So at the end of the week, it was close to, I was there for 7 days, so I was 63 miles at least. It could have been more because I didn't calculate yesterday yet. I'd walked 63. It was more than 9 miles, so in 6 days I'd walked 63 miles, I think. But whatever, it was 63 miles, some combination of part of the day because of all that stuff with when I checked the phone and all that thing. So I'd walked 63 miles in Copenhagen, if not more, because I didn't calculate yesterday. So Soren had this quote, and you've heard it before, likely, that there was never a problem he couldn't walk himself out of, because when you walk, you think. And walking is very, very therapeutic. It's shown to be almost as effective for some types of depression as medication would be, and if not more, because it's healthy. And so when I go on vacation, I like to walk anyway, because I think it's the street level is the most interesting level. You see things you'd never see versus a tour bus or a train or whatever, or plane, obviously. So I walked a lot, and because I was eating a lot and drinking enough beer, I didn't go crazy there. I didn't drink a ton of beer. I think the most beer I had one day was probably 4. Excuse me, and that might have been Sunday because the Eagles were playing. And it wound up being Sunday night in Copenhagen because it was 7:00 at night. But here in the States and Eastern Standard Time, it's 1:00, which is pretty typical. Most NFL Eagle football that I watch is usually at 1. Sometimes the game is flexed to 4, and sometimes it's flexed to being the game of the week or whatever. But I went to this sports bar of sorts. It wasn't really like a sports bar that we would see in the States, like really, really big with hundreds of screens and chicken wings and all that. It was like a kind of a regular bar that just caters to sports. And a little bit of a Philly contingent wound up showing up, which was super interesting. So I think I had four beers on that day, maybe. I had one earlier after I got done with my walk with Johannes. And then I headed to this place to see the Eagles game, and they won barely, so they didn't knock the game out at all. They still look like last year's team in a lot of ways, but Hurts didn't throw an interception or fumble the ball, so that's progress. So what else did Johannes and I talk about? I just love the fact that he took the time to meet with me. He only asked for the equivalent of $10 for doing it, and I feel bad in retrospect that I didn't give him more money because I certainly could have. But I had asked him ahead of time how much would a tour cost, and he told me approximately what it would cost, and that's what I paid him. Now, he did tell me that the University of Copenhagen, this is probably a story that I'll kind of finish up here. I'm going to try to get to 40 minutes. I said I'm in a bit of a concussed state right now because of all the travel. So excuse my jumping around a bit, but it's what he wanted to be paid, so that's why I paid him. But he did tell me this thing that opens up an opportunity maybe in the future for me to contribute more to the stuff he's involved in and to Kierkegaard's scholarship in general. But the University of Copenhagen has this large building that used to be the library. It's this huge brick building, goes on for about a block, but apparently it's not a 21st century building. Like libraries these days are really tech hubs where you have like a lot of conference rooms and whatever the deal is with this building. It can't really be turned into a modern library. And this is the library that Soren would have gone to read books when he was a student over all those years that he was working on his degree. And there's some talk about letting an organization use this building, and the organization is going to be dedicated to Kierkegaard scholarships. So they've gotten some funding already. It's not a lot. It's like maybe $30,000 equivalent of United States dollars. And the meetings are in the process of being set up. So things just haven't come to fruition quite yet, but the ideas are there. So there's a chance. And they already have the theology department or something dedicated to Kierkegaard, which is really interesting. So Soren was not a theology major. He had started off as one and then switched over to philosophy and literature. We're thankful that he did because he needed to get out of Christendom. He really did. That would have killed him to stay in theology. And I think there's a place for theology, don't get me wrong. But it was very rational. Theology in Copenhagen at that time in Christendom was very rational, very much affected by Hegel, which is how the mind, the mind is everything, human reason is everything as much as possible. And even they started doubting human reason too, because it's just they unmoored themselves from the scriptures in a real sense, and they just started philosophizing in the air, kind of, and they have insights for sure, but it doesn't make sense in the end. So there's talk about using this very large, beautiful building that's from Soren's times to house this Soren Kierkegaard Center or something. And we already have one in the United States. It's at St. Olaf College out in Minnesota. It's really close to where my brother and his family live. So I had tried to visit there back when I did my 8,000-mile road trip across the United States, because I came through Minneapolis. But they were having this blizzard coming, and it just wasn't a good idea because the storm was coming, and the person was not supposed to work that day, but she was willing to meet me there. She'd been very nice, but I could put her in danger if we tried to meet. So I just bailed out on that visit to St. Olaf College. But that Kierkegaard Center does exist at St. Olaf College, which is a Lutheran college, and that's through the Hong's efforts, the people that translate all those books. But this would be amazing if Copenhagen itself, the University of Copenhagen, where Soren attended and got his degree, if they had that center. Because it's interesting, Soren just doesn't have a lot of traction in Copenhagen. I can't figure it out. There's got to be something about the Copenhagen character that does not make it resonate with Soren. And it's the oddest thing, because you would think if you're a small country, and there's another notable person that has come from Copenhagen. It's Niels Bohr, the guy that investigated and kind of discovered quantum mechanics, a physicist. Kind of got into it was kind of a exploration of how Newton's laws didn't add up entirely, they were mechanical, but on a subatomic level. Niels Bohr got into how electrons and stuff act differently. It's really interesting. It's way beyond me in terms of the physics, of course. I can appreciate the philosophy a bit. So anyway, it'd be neat for them to open that center, and if they did, I'd be willing to contribute to it, both monetarily and also in terms of just being a part of it, And I'd be careful because I'm unofficially a Kierkegaard adherent or following here. But let me just see if we can read a little bit of this. Training in Christianity, which is the book that I read in addition to that summary book that I just bought at that Copenhagen bookstore. So Soren titled this Invocation, and I believe, he wrote this under his own name, so he was much more open about this as his own writings. It is 1800 years and more since Jesus Christ walked here on earth, but this is not an event like other events, which only when they are bygone pass over into history, and then as events long bygone pass over into forgetfulness. No, his presence here on earth never becomes a bygone event. It never becomes more and more bygone, in case faith is to be found on earth. And if not, then indeed at the very instant is a very long time since he lived. But so long as there is a believer, such a one must, in order to become such, have been, and as a believer must continue to be, just as contemporary with his presence on earth as were those first contemporaries. The contemporaneousness is the condition of faith, and more closely defined, it is faith. O Lord Jesus Christ, would that we might also be contemporary with thee, see thee in thy true form, and in the actual environment in which thou didst walk here on earth, not in the form in which an empty and meaningless tradition, or thoughtless and superstition, or gossipy, historical tradition has deformed thee, for it is not in the form of abasement the believer sees thee, and it cannot possibly be in the form of glory in which no man has yet seen thee. And there are very few people had seen Jesus in his glory. I think it was John and two other disciples, of course, when he was transfigured before he was crucified a couple of days later. Would that we might see thee as thou art and wast, and wilt be until thy return in glory. See thee as a sign of offense and the object of faith, the lowly man, and yet the Savior and Redeemer of the race. Oh, man, that's powerful. That's powerful. And I was reading this book over on the plane because I just couldn't sleep. And we were going, the sun was going against us. So I was working against the day. So I think it's harder to travel to where the sun had risen earlier. To go against the sun is hard, at least it is for me. I'd have to talk to people that travel more. But going against the sunrise, man, that was really, really difficult. When I got to my hotel room a week ago, a little bit more than a week ago, I had a kind of a meltdown of sorts. I was really beat up. I was very fractured from the trip. There had been another screaming baby on both flights, and one of the women, maybe it was grandmother or something, was walking the baby down the aisle to try to calm the baby down, which means she was taking the screaming baby from the back of the plane, which was farther away, and bringing the baby right next to my ear and then walking back to the back. And I understood why she was doing that, but it was like kind of like blaring a speaker right in people's ears at the worst time of night, So when I got to my hotel room, I was beat up, and I was reading about how Jesus was the lowly one, and and humble, and was an offense and disrespected, and I came to a space that I was feeling like maybe this is where God wants me to be so burdened by my experience that I just throw up my hands and say, God, have mercy on me, and just weep, just cry. And I have to be honest, I'm not a crier. I was when I was a kid, but my dad kind of got it out of me. I grew up in a pretty much German family, German-American family, but more German than American, my family was. We spoke English, but we thought in German. And so I know that mentality. I know the mentality that or I know the mentality that struggles with Jesus in terms of the vulnerability piece, because the stiff upper lip and we can do it. And you just keep on keeping on. You keep grinding away. You keep swimming against the tide. That's my mentality. But I got to the hotel room and I was just undone, and I was crying, and my heart was hurting, and my body was just convulsing with pain. And I have to think that all that this trip did was it broke me open a little bit. That all this pain's already in me from my life experiences from the day I was born until now. But I have a hard time getting to it because it's like radioactive material, man. It's behind closed doors and safely behind concrete. And it takes certain experiences just to crack it open. And glory to be to God. I know I'm not articulating this well. But last Wednesday, a week ago, I was weeping, boy. Hot tears were coming from my soul, and I was just, Lord, I'm so tired, and it hurt so bad. And why's my life been so hard? And maybe the gift of tears, the gift of hot tears. There's something about if Jesus cries, he's telling us something, men. I'm going to talk to men here because that's mostly my audience. I know women don't listen to this. Women don't like me normally. They might find me interesting, but I don't draw a crowd of women sometimes. Let's put it that way. Although I met some really cool women from Britain at a bar, and they were extremely kind to me, and they gave me hugs at the end, which really weirded me out because I'm not a toucher and a feeler. But they were cool. And one of them has a dog named Ralphie. She's telling me about a little dachshund that she has. She has a little Instagram page dedicated to it. So now I'm following Ralphie. But yeah, God cracked me open, man. He cracked me open like all this frozen water on the top of my soul, and just, man, that hot emotion, and that just the tripping so hard, and just not sleeping for like, man, I don't know, it was wound up being like maybe 40 hours before I slept or something. I know it's an exaggeration, but whatever it was, God cracked me open, and for a brief moment of time, the deep was called, and the deep responded. So it was an interesting experience for that alone, in the sense I had tears coming out of my eyes, and I felt very close to Jesus. I felt very close to God because the man of sorrows, it's we want to clean Jesus up. We want to take the blood off the carpet. We want to put him in a finery, and we want to turn him into a relic or an icon. Don't want to treat him like a living individual that he is, contemporary. We were contemporary with him. So sometimes God has to rock our boat, tear our sails, and make us vulnerable before we see his vulnerability, before we see the vulnerability of Christ. So anyway, I thank you to those who reach out to me and give me encouragement, because sometimes I know it can be perceived as being extremely narcissistic and selfish. And we all are this way to one degree or another. I absolutely admit that I'm self-centered, whatever, it's just the way it is. I think most of us are. Maybe me more so than most, because I was actually cocky enough to think I could start a podcast about Soren Kierkegaard 3 years ago, and here I am, still doing it. Oh, I got the Christiana, by the way. I have a lot more to share. I really do. But today I wanted to focus on the funeral and how, in his death, Soren attracted the people that he was attracted to during life. And I think if that's not a testimony to how he followed in the path of Jesus, I don't think there's much else I can say. It is proof positive to me that those people felt called from the street to come into the church and pay their respects. And in paying their respects to Soren, they affirmed through the mouth of their witness that he indeed was about what he talked about. And that's how I'm going to conclude. So thank you for those that reach out and give me encouragement on this podcast. I know I'm not screaming into the void. I know it can be perceived as selfish. I know it can be perceived as self-referential, talking about my story and this and that. I get it. I completely get it. I'm not that narcissistic that I don't see that. But I believe God is at work in some really strange way with this podcast. And I am convinced, and I'm doing the hard work. I'm not avoiding it. I went to Copenhagen. I bought all of his books. I might go to St. Olaf College and get in the library. I'm doing the hard work to make this thing work within my own way of doing it. But I thank you when you reach out, because it's just a testimony to me that this is not in vain. And I'm not saying it's going to become a top 10 podcast or a top 100 podcast or top 1,000 podcast. I don't care. All I want to know is that God has given me this work to do. For some reason, He's allowed me to be the person to do this. And there's probably 1,000 more qualified people that just didn't hear His voice. So I did, because I was in a life situation where I needed something worthwhile to do. And this became it. And so we'll leave it at that. Amen and hallelujah. I'm praying for y'all. And I think we may take on training Christianity next after the 18 Upbuilding Discourses. I have to tell you, part of this book has been very hard to work through. But I can't judge the end from the beginning quite yet. I have to work through it and see how it makes me feel after I read the whole thing, get the big picture. So we'll leave it at that. Amen.